And joining me now to talk about the consequences of a nuclear North Korea, Ankit Panda is an international affairs analyst. He's in New York City tonight. And Tom Wright is the author of All Measures Short of War and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He is in Washington. And Mr. Wright, let me begin with you. The Trump administration says denuclearization is the priority. But are we past that point? Is it even still an option?
I think we are past that point. Denuclearization has been US policy for a couple of decades now, and even when North Korea carried out nuclear tests in past years, some people may have clung to the hope that a freeze might be possible or long-term denuclearization may be achievable. But what we've learned really with Kim Jong-un is that he's absolutely determined not only to develop the nuclear weapons program, but to specifically develop ICBMs that can hit the United States, which he sees as a key part of his strategy. And that, I think, really is the genie is now out of the bottle. The US needs to accept that denuclearization is a very laudable goal, but its time has passed, and we need to come to terms with the nuclear threat that North Korea poses.
Mr. Panda, would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I would only add that the question of the reality of denuclearization is clear. I agree with Tom that we're past the point.
So what
and I
next,
think Kim Jong-un has certainly made that clear with his 6th nuclear test. I think the next steps will be really dependent on what we see out of North Korea. There are 2 routes to denuclearization. One of them is voluntary, where North Korea sees something that it wants from the United States or the international community, incentives, and it agrees to enter negotiations. I don't think that's likely anytime soon. And the other option is coercive. And I think with nuclear weapons, that's especially difficult, since North Korea can put the United States and its allies at risk. However, I should note that North Korea itself does talk about denuclearization still. After its July 4th ICBM test, it put out a statement paraphrasing its leader, Kim Jong-un, noting that as long as the United States' hostile policy, quote-unquote, remains in place, North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles will never come on the table. That implied that if the hostile policy, which North Korea takes to mean the United States' system of alliances, its nuclear deterrence assurances to Japan and South Korea, would be lifted, then it might consider denuclearization, but obviously that is an unrealistic ask.
Well, Mr. Wright, let me get your thoughts on that. The U.S. clearly will have to put something on the table if it wants to see a way out of this, if there is no way to, as you say, put the genie back in the bottle. So what can the U.S. offer to try to get North Korea to negotiate?
It's interesting to note that, Steve Bannon, in the interview with the American Prospect a few days before he left the White House, floated exactly such a deal. He said that he was personally in favor of a deal that would result in the withdrawal of all US troops in the Korean Peninsula in exchange for a freeze. And that may give some short-term protection to American cities, but I think it will come at a very long-term cost and risk of conflict in East Asia, and really also an end to the regional order and to US influence in the Asia-Pacific.
And Mr. Panda, let me get your thoughts on that. Even were there to be a freeze on from North Korea, doesn't that just leave us where we are now?
Well, in a way, what it does do is it does reduce the risks of miscalculation, which is something that I grow increasingly concerned about, given that in some ways, the Trump administration, with its remarks on fire and fury, has been trying to outdo North Korea at its own game of provocations. And that is concerning. The game that North Korea is currently playing with its long-range missiles is that it's trying to decouple the United States from its allies. What that means is it's trying to get Washington to acknowledge that it would not leave New York City, it would not leave Los Angeles at risk to save Seoul or Tokyo. And that's dangerous. That's a familiar game that the United States experienced during the Cold War when the Soviet Union operationalized ICBMs, and it required deft management and leadership and allied reassurance. There are signals that the Trump administration is trying to do its best, especially Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have been making efforts with their counterparts in Japan and South Korea to keep the assurances up.
Is that right?
But that does make things difficult.
Many people say that Donald Trump, the president himself, is making things worse with his rhetoric.
Yes. So the president's rhetoric is what I do worry about. For example, his statement today that he had allowed Japan and South Korea to purchase more arms from the United States. While that might seem reassuring to some, it does actually increase the ability of both these countries to autonomously strike North Korea potentially in the future, and could actually exacerbate this decoupling problem that North Korea is seeking to accelerate.
Well, I thank you both very much for your thoughts tonight.